So in this video we're going to be talking about intellectual life in classical Athens, and essentially there are a number of different ways of looking at this, but a number of different ways in which this comes forth, but the overriding principle is that human reason is paramount, that the human intellectual capacity is the means by which growth and achievement of a culture can be achieved, and that the most important venue of intellect and reason is discourse, is public interaction. This is why theater and the performance of works of art like poetry and so forth are so important, but even philosophy and history and so forth are things that are conducted in public, are conducted interactively with audiences, and are understood as contributions to an intellectual environment, to what Milton would later call a marketplace of ideas. And so one of the key things about philosophy is that it is understood as being the same kind of thing as science in the Greek world. And normally this is said in a negative way. In other words, that the Greeks did not practice experimental scientific method in the way that was later crucial to modern scientists. But the real thing that is fascinating about this is that philosophers that were interested in the physical world, natural philosophers, were looking for organizational principles. The defining characteristic is to look for ways in which the world around us could be understood and organized and defined in a rational, systematic way. And this search for a system is the way in which philosophy is the underpinning of science. Even philosophy that deals with morality is really an attempt to systematize and organize rationally the understanding of human behavior and how humans interact in the world. And so if we start out early on with somebody like Anaxagoras, who is talking about nous, the key thing about nous is the search for the organizing principle, the fact that it is an organizing principle, a rational, systematic organizing principle that is the creative force that characterizes the world around us. The world around us in the ancient world is normally put down to the random and whimsical and capricious acts of the gods, and the ups and downs of the destructive and creative forces of nature, or later on a development of a creative moment that brings everything into being in ways that is still to a very large extent arbitrary. But Anaxagoras and the Greek natural philosophers in general are looking for organizing principles that do not require the capricious, unbound, unsystematic acts of the gods. There's a subtext here that the divine, in the way that it's understood in Greek theology, is the antithesis of man, the antithesis of the mortal world. The mortal world has always been defined by mortality and morality, two things that are characteristic of human beings and by definition uncharacteristic of the gods. And the extension of morality is already an organized system of rules that create order and structure. The Greek philosophers are taking this one step further and saying that that rationality, that reason and system is a characteristic of man, and that and this is a means by which mortals are empowered, can acquire all of the knowledge that is available in the world around us. And so the theories develop as to how the universe is organized and what is the stuff of the world around us that is not just, you know, the outcome of, you know, various you know, abstractly defined beings. That is, you know, that is not merely the result of the actions of a, you know, the mother goddess, or, you know, the later kinds of gods that come along, but that the reason is capable of delineating in ways that are understandable the actual nature of the world around us. And so with Empedokles, we have the theory that everything in the world is made up of a combination of 4 different kinds of elements that are combined together or repelled from each other, that there are attractive forces and repulsive forces, you know, all of which, you know, you know, on the one hand can be described as very pre-scientific and pre-pagan, but on the other hand, you know, the actual, you know, physics of the natural world and of chemistry can be defined in these exact terms, in terms of composite elements and forces of attraction and repulsion. And we can take this even further with Leukippos and Demokritos, who famously developed a theory that that provided the foundation for, you know, modern physics, the theory of the atom, the theory that there are you know, tremendously small particles of matter, out of which through different kinds of combinations, through different forms of these particles, together make up the larger substances of the universe, and that these are put together in systematic ways, the rules to which can be discovered. The fact that you know, the atom, you know, the word means you know, undividable, and so the you know, modern atomic science has proved that the atom can be divided. This is immaterial to the fundamental contribution of looking at the world around us in a way that is as pragmatic as possible, and that establishes a system that functions according to knowable rules. And so the practical applications for this are not just in terms of how people understand the world, how people can understand the physical world around us, but understanding the physics of the systems that we have to deal with on a daily basis. So on a macro scale, this involves weather and irrigation and agriculture and these kinds of things. But even closer to home, the human body is a system that once you've started down this road, it starts to become possible to assemble you know, bodies of knowledge, and this is how Hippokrates and later Galen approached the idea of medicine, is to begin with what is known and build up a system by adding to it what can be understood, what can be fit within the system, what turns out not to be the case through not fitting into the system. Through you know, and in the treatment of illness, we have you know, an early form of experimental science. In other words, you know, once you have a system of knowledge that involves you know, a rational process of medicine, you can evaluate treatments that work and treatments that don't, according to questions, according to principles, according to you know, the overall structure. The interesting thing about this is that this starts with what is sort of known collectively here and there throughout the land and from other sources and so forth. It starts with the kind of thing that is sort of common knowledge and practical wisdom, the kind of thing that we now sometimes refer to as old wives' tales. As it turns out, these bodies of knowledge tend to be divided in terms of how illnesses are treated in general, and in particular how illnesses and problems related to the female body are treated. In other words, there's from the beginning a special body of knowledge that is quite extensive that deals with gynecology. And so gynecology becomes the first medical specialty, and it starts out being a broader body of knowledge in some ways than the body of knowledge that pertains only to men, if you want to look at it that way. But either way, it was understood from the beginning that medicine pertained to men and to women. That medicine was important. The understanding of how these processes worked involved the two distinct but related systems of the male body and the female body. When we come to the understanding of human behavior, one of the ways in which philosophy was practiced, one of the ways in which broader knowledge was attempted to be gained, was in the study of what had gone before, in the study of prior events in order to make sense of them so that conclusions can be drawn about different peoples, about human behavior, about attitudes and expectations. And so in this respect, the historical work of Herodotos fits right into this. Herodotus tells the story of the Persian Wars, doing so according to a method that examines the expectations and customs of the peoples involved in order to see how that fits in with their behaviors and see how they interact with each other when different customs, when different societies come into conflict. In other words, his approach to the Persian Wars, for example, is to talk about the events that took place during these wars in the context of who are the Persians, who are the Greeks, who are the Spartans, who are the Athenians, and to place that in an even larger context of the rest of the ancient world. Herodotus attempts to impugn meaning into his assessments of the Persians and the Greeks by placing them in context of practices of other societies, of the Egyptians, of the Babylonians, and so forth, so that there's a framework of human behavior in which the Persians and the Greeks are particular. And so this approach to history is sociological, is anecdotal, but it still is an attempt to find meaning, and he tells his story of the Persian War with an intent, with a desire not just simply to come up with some kind of meaning, but with an argument about Greek and Persian society that he uses the available evidence to fit. And so in that way, Herodotus ties in with the the more famous in some ways as the actual father of history, Thucydides. Thucydides tells the story of the Peloponnesian War in a way that is in some ways more recognizable as history as practiced by moderns. In other words, he practices an historical method. He meticulously accumulates as much first-hand evidence as possible, records and documents and testimony, and then uses this as the basis for evidence for his conclusions, for the thesis that he has and the arguments that he makes. And so Thucydides is deliberately trying to explain the Peloponnesian War according to a particular thesis. You know, to sort of oversimplify a little bit, he believes that the Athenians are to blame for the Peloponnesian War. They brought it upon themselves through an excessive overreach, through an arrogant and aggressive imperialism that darkened the openness of the Greek world and necessitated a negative response. There's also an undercurrent of the broader demos in conflict with the Aristoi, that is the demos present in Athens being aggressive and attacking the Aristoi as represented by Sparta. And so Thucydides is making an argument that is systematic, and the process for doing this is to meticulously tell the story through objective evidence. And so, you know, this in contrast to Herodotos, therefore seems more subjective. Herodotus is feeling out how the societies of the world seem from the stories that he's been told and the peoples that he's talked to, but in other ways they're both originating the basic idea of history, which is to explain human behavior in a specific series of events through the careful accumulation of evidence. History itself would have been seen as a form of rhetoric. It would have been seen as a form of persuasive argument, and so in both cases, this is going to be something that is both rational and public, something that is interactive, something that is, like all art, and especially Greek art, is designed to provoke a response in the audience. You know, even more so when we get to tragedy. And so we've talked about tragedy and the way in which it develops as something that is interactive on stage and at the same time interactive with the audience. So in other words, Greek drama develops as a form in which the actor stands upon the stage, you know, representing the voice, you know, sort of both literally and metaphorically. In other words, the dialogue and the representation of particular characters from very well-known stories interacting with a chorus that you know, represents both sort of conventional wisdom and the point of view that the author is trying to get across. And so what's striking about tragedy is it's this extremely public manifestation of the rational process by which the Greeks are trying to understand themselves and the world behavior, understand the mechanisms of society, and the process under which it goes is evolutionary, just like everything else in the Greek world, especially everything else in Athens. So we start out with the earliest of the famous tragedians, Aeschylos. Aeschylos has two actors on stage interacting with the chorus, and you know, he's characterized as being as representing the world in some ways very much like Homer, in that it involves important people sort of interacting with the gods, and the conclusions that come about have to do with important, moral strictures that the tragic heroes have violated. Even more so, Sophokles, who introduces a third actor potentially, and who is showing the actions of people, the choices of people being responded to by gods. The gods dispensing justice at the end of the play, the Deus ex machina. But the thing about Aeschylus and Sophocles is that even with the judgments of the gods involved, it is still the choices of individuals that are key, and the choices are complex and not necessarily cut and dried. So if you look at the Oedipal plays by Sophocles, and especially if you look at the whole trilogy, if you look at Antigone, for example, there are a number of, the cases that can be made on both sides of the tragedy that are understandable, that have some reason to them, and so the choices that people make have to not just be sensible, but have to take into account the larger ramifications. They have to take into account the meaning that they have, not just for themselves, but for the community as a whole. There's you can look at these plays, and it's the antagonist is not necessarily the villain, because the antagonist is acting according to principles that make sense to him. By the time we get to Euripides, the what is right and wrong becomes a matter of open debate. By the time we get to Euripides, the reliance upon the gods for the dispensing of justice has become somewhat deprecated, and there's an understanding that the justice needs to come from the community itself. And if that is the case, what is the basis for this justice? And so this is where we get into the question of how exactly do we define justice, and according to whom do we determine what justice is supposed to be? And what we find in Euripides that justice is often subjective and malleable, and creates harmony and disharmony according to circumstance and according to chance. That the gift of humanity is reason, but the world itself does not provide all of the answers for human beings, for men or for women. And that the creation of knowledge is vitally important, just because the society that the Athenians find themselves living in is not yet the ideal, and the understanding in some ways seems further away now that it is the responsibility and onus of the Athenian community itself. And so in this context, it is in this context that comedy develops, as discussed elsewhere, comedy being a targeted focus on something that can be identified as wrong, as problematic, as dangerous. And in this way, subjective justice can be imposed in such a way that rhetoric is used, comedy is used to convince an audience through both reason and the sort of irrational process of ridicule, to convince an audience of a wrong that might not be immediately identifiable as such, a wrong that some people feel is right and just. And so, the very existence of comedy demonstrates the way in which the Athenians are grappling with a question that must have seemed almost impossible to solve, but what was necessary to bring a solution to, in order to make society work at all. And we'll see more about how this plays out as we go along. For now, that's that.